I think as well points to an issue with many of these wars, as Donald Trump calls them, that he's sort of claiming to have solved is what's your definition of a war versus a conflict versus an escalation versus, a hot period. And, if you take the temperature down on a specific event, that doesn't mean that you've solved the whole war.
Hi, guys.
Hey,
Hi, how are you both?
Surviving.
surviving. And if you think about it, just last week we were talking, and so much again has happened. And in particular, a great week to talk about foreign policy and peace agreements, because I feel like the three of us, that's what we've been really covering across the BBC nonstop. In particular, the ceasefire agreement for the war in Gaza.
Exactly. And this is number 8 on President Trump's list of the 8 wars, as he calls them, that he says he has solved since coming into office. Of course, we remember in his inaugural address when he spoke about how he wanted to be the peacemaker. I mean, maybe will we go over these 8 wars that he claims to have solved and talk through some of them?
I never expected to talk so much about foreign policy in Trump's second administration. I mean, as you guys both know, US presidents often turn abroad to try and divert attention when things aren't going their way at home. But Trump has taken this to a new level in his quest to become a global peacemaker.
I was thinking about that, and I wonder if he's realized, with all his decades of experience as a deal maker and negotiator, that actually it's a lot easier in a way for a president to go abroad and gather world leaders who hang out with other world leaders as they do and have these talks and negotiations. Whereas when you're in your own country trying to do things on the domestic front, you have to deal with, the other branches of power, don't you? You have to deal with Congress, you have to deal with the courts.
I think that's absolutely right. And it's a question of leverage, isn't it? What kind of leverage that the US president can actually wield abroad versus here at home. That's a really important point that you make, Katrina. And I think that really hit home when I was watching those images of the president in Sharm el Sheikh, and he was standing on that stage where they were going to take a family photo, but each world leader was coming up to take a photo specifically with the president. It was really remarkable. And of course, for President Trump, we have to say, and I've been speaking to countless analysts over the last week or so about this Gaza ceasefire agreement, and with all the caveats and caution about all the ways this could fall apart in the next phase of negotiations, there is agreement that it really was President Trump's pressure and his ability to negotiate, of course, through his envoy and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner's advisor, that brought this across the line.
Yeah, and the White House actually had a call with reporters, just again to emphasize we are in the first stage. They're trying to move into the second stage of this truce to talk about where some of the sticking points remain. So it is all very fragile. This is going to take a lot of handholding by the US and its partners in the region to really implement this deal and see some of the reconstruction that they're talking about.
And I think that's the key to, and what you were talking about, Sumi, all those leaders going up on the stage with that Peace 2025 sign. One of our colleagues in the press pool sent a picture of the reverse angle of that, which was all of the world leaders lined up along the side of that room, waiting their turn to go up to President Trump. And when you think just a couple of weeks ago, the US was really the outlier in the international community when it came to Gaza, not recognizing the two-state solution, the remarks that he made at UNGA and so on. And then all of a sudden he was there. Now, not everyone was there, of course, we have to point out. There was no Israeli prime minister there. There was no Iranian supreme leader. There were many sort of notable absences. But to have all of these people queuing up, and the analysts that I've been speaking to have been saying to me, what happens now? How do you take that very public display of diplomacy and international unity and so on and turn it into something that can action on what you're talking about there, Courtney, which is this very fragile sense that, the White House had this glory moment, but that can end and fall apart really quickly?
I would add that all of the analysts I've been speaking to have almost to a T said the exact two same phrases, which is one, Donald Trump is not a details person, so he thinks about the broad strokes, which in fact seems to be a benefit in being able to get this ceasefire agreement. And the second point that they keep making is that Donald Trump is someone who has a shorter attention span. So how do you keep this president and this administration engaged in this process to make sure that this peace continues? Now, you could say that you have a Steve Witkoff who is not going to perhaps be looking at the Ukraine war, and Jared Kushner continues to negotiate, or other members of his team. But do they carry the same clout and weight that President Trump does? Of course not. So that's going to be one of the difficulties in ensuring that this process goes forward smoothly.
I thought that briefing call that you mentioned, Courtney, was really interesting, with the senior officials saying that they had been in Gaza in the last week or so, and they seemed genuinely impacted by what they had seen there. That when they got on the ground, I mean, one of them used the word pulverized and said, they couldn't fathom how people were making walks to try and get food or relocate themselves when there were 50, 60 feet high piles of rubble along the sides of, what you can't even call streets. So I think the fact that these senior people have seen that for themselves maybe will help keep the focus there. And, when you're talking about someone like Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, even if Witkoff goes to focus on Ukraine and Russia, the sense coming from the region is they do speak for the president, and they're so close to the president that speaking to them is as good as speaking to the man himself, in a way that maybe in past administrations that wasn't the kind of sense that people got from envoys.
And you've seen the return of Jared Kushner, right? He doesn't hold an official job within this administration, but he has reemerged as one of Trump's most senior advisors in the region. He was instrumental to the Abraham Accords, which of course is one of Trump's big legacy pieces from his first term. And he is in constant contact with countries in this region. So I think having Jared Kushner involved again and fully focused on this is something that will ensure that they continue to engage the president on this. But the other thing I want to mention is, I think we also have to see how this international stabilization force takes shape. Who are the countries that are going to be involved? They said on this call that they'd had positive conversations with Indonesia, Egypt, Qatar, and Azerbaijan as some of the countries who had expressed interest. But I think it'll be a big question about just which players are going to be involved and how that is going to affect this truce.
And whether there's any place for the US in that.
Yes.
Yeah, that's an important point. And interesting to hear the president, in the day, of course, that marathon day that he had in the region celebrating the signing of the ceasefire agreement, was also asked about Iran. And that's another conflict that the president says that he has ended, the Israel-Iran conflict. And of course, we all remember this summer covering those remarkable U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. And it really wasn't clear at that moment what happens here, what happens next. Will the Iranians then retaliate? And could we end up seeing the U.S. kind of dragged into some sort of conflict with Iran itself? I mean, at the moment, the Israel-Iran conflict, of course, is not a hot one. But if you listen to what the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, said, he clearly doesn't want to see the type of nuclear agreement that was made with the Iranians in previous administrations to come to bear again, because he sees that as perhaps a threat to Israel and to his leadership.
The balance of power has certainly shifted in Israel's favor, right, in the region. But I think the question is, where does Iran go from here? There's a big question mark over whether this has actually been solved or it's just sort of on ice at the moment.
I think you can say that the president stopped that really hot phase, right, with the US involvement and Operation Midnight Hammer and so on. But even when you look back to that day in Sharm el-Sheikh earlier in the week, Israel invited at the last minute, didn't go. Iran said it wasn't going purely because Israel had been invited in the first place. They're not remarks and actions of countries who are not, or who are in a friendly situation with each other. So, if we're talking about these 8 wars, can you say that they've been ended or not? If you're very specific to that hot phase, then yes. But an ongoing conflict, then you would have to say no, wouldn't you?
Yes, this is something that isn't solved within a day or Donald Trump coming in and launching missiles. And, as you said, Katrina, certainly it ended that sort of flare up, right? But this is a long-standing issue with lots of complexity and nuance that is going to take years to try and solve. And I just don't think that he can really claim this as something that he's solved.
Yeah, in particular, if there is kind of no forward movement on negotiations with Iran at some point. I'm really interested in one of the wars that President Trump says he solved, which is India Pakistan. And this has been such a fascinating one. I mean, some of our listeners or viewers will remember that back in May, hostilities did break out between India and Pakistan. There was an attack launched in Indian administered Kashmir. And after that, India struck into Pakistan. And President Trump says that he had called both countries and said, I will use the power of the economy and the threat of tariffs to, force both sides to stand down here. And he said that was successful. And interesting that at the time, Pakistan said, President Trump was able to broker peace, and they said they were nominating him for the Nobel Peace Prize. And I thought it was fascinating in Sharm el-Sheikh that Shehbaz Sharif, who's the Pakistani prime minister, said that Pakistan was again going to nominate President Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize, which, as we know, he's very keen on getting. And, his administration has criticized the fact that he wasn't awarded the Nobel Peace Prize this year. But India has said, in fact, I wrote down what the foreign minister had said at the time that President Trump had taken credit for solving this flare-up in violence. And he said, the talks regarding cessation of military action were held directly between India and Pakistan under the existing channels established by both militaries. So India's been very clear about the fact that President Trump didn't play a role in stopping that fighting. And we understand that in a phone call, the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, who Donald Trump says is a good friend of his, also made that clear.
Yeah, this is one of the more interesting ones for me, just because it strikes at the very heart of the, Indian identity. So this conflict is as old as the founding of these countries, right? And it seems that Donald Trump has found the sort of one thing that Narendra Modi really can't back down on. So much of his brand is wrapped up in being tough on Pakistan. And the country has always said, India has always said, we do not accept foreign intervention when it comes to relations with Pakistan. But Donald Trump, of course, looking to, up his record on the world stage, said, insisted that he was involved in this. And again, that is just something domestically that Narendra Modi just cannot say that he had another country intervene. It would make him look weak. And that is, his chief concern as the leader of India.
I think as well points to an issue with many of these wars, as Donald Trump calls them, that he's sort of claiming to have solved, is what's your definition of a war versus a conflict versus an escalation versus, a hot period. And, if you take the temperature down on a specific event, that doesn't mean that you've solved the whole war.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see the next time those two meet and whether Donald Trump brings it up again and how Modi reacts. I will certainly be watching out for that. But one of the other conflicts on this list is the one between Armenia and Azerbaijan. He hosted both leaders at the White House in August, and this, of course, was 5 months after both countries had come to a peace agreement. They had announced back in March. And this dispute is over the Nagorno-Karabakh region in the Caucasus, which is populated by Armenians, but is internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan. Again, this is another conflict where, they fought 2 wars. This has been going on for some 30 years. But it does seem that he had some success here when he hosted these 2 leaders. Both have said he should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. They established a transportation route that they want to name in honor of Trump. One of our colleagues has gone and written about this. That it doesn't seem that much has happened there. But I think most importantly, both countries have yet to ratify the agreements. And there's some sticking points. Azerbaijan wants Armenia to change its constitution, and that's something that certainly would probably fall short if it was put before Armenian voters. So, there are still a lot of things on the table here in terms of whether this uh, truly counts as, peace. But it seems that both leaders have reached an agreement that, you know, is a starting point for a solution.
And I think this is one that you can probably say you can put, if you have a list, a check mark there for President Trump, because indeed those images of the two leaders sitting with the president and signing a paper, I mean, that was a big breakthrough, indeed, significant. At the moment, this kind of war hot phase that President Trump solved appears to be holding, and both leaders appear to be very happy that Donald Trump intervened there. So I think this is really one that you can say you can credit to President Trump.
Another one that falls into a similar category is Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Foreign ministers from both of those countries were in the Oval Office in June, again signing a piece of paper there. They're not formally at war with each other, of course. It's actually the war in Congo with many rebel groups, about 100 rebel groups fighting there. The biggest and most violent, of course, is M23, which is backed by Rwanda. You had those scenes with the president there, and as I say, the foreign ministers from the DRC and Rwanda signing this document. However, it hasn't really led to peace in the DRC because this pact wasn't signed between Congo and the rebels. They weren't any part of it. And in fact, there's been reporting in the region from the rebel leaders of M23 that any process that they're not a party to isn't a process. But it was a piece of paper, it was signed, but it doesn't seem really by very many observers in the region and objective analysts to actually have caused much change on the ground.
It's hard to say. It's hard for him to say that he's solved this when the fighting is still ongoing.
Yeah, exactly.
And if we talk about, the question of an attention span and how much the president can actually dedicate to various conflicts, when, of course, there's domestic policy and really kind of geopolitically huge wars raging, obviously Ukraine and Gaza, Israel now in a ceasefire, it does appear that the administration's attention has turned away from this conflict. And I was also interested to look at one of the conflicts that President Trump said that he solved or prevented an outbreak of hostilities, which is between Serbia and Kosovo. And I had been looking at what he had said on this. He said, they were going to go at it, going to be a big war. And I said, you go at it, there's no trade with the US. They said, well, maybe we won't go at it. And President Trump says, okay, I, through that, prevented, through the use of that big stake of the US economy and tariffs, prevented tensions from breaking out into actual hostilities, so a hot war. Anybody who is, the least bit a student of contemporary history knows that this is a conflict that dates back to the 90s and the Balkan Wars, and that the animosities are extremely bitter and deeply seated. And, that preventing the outbreak of hostilities clearly is a positive thing, but that the problem, or let's say the conflict, is far from solved, even if there's not fighting on the ground. And there are some observers who have said, look, you can't say you've solved a war if you've prevented an outbreak of hostilities, but haven't actually solved the underlying problem, which is obviously something that applies to some of the other conflicts we've been discussing here as well. So it's curious that this has been added to the list of wars that President Trump has solved. But of course, we have to say an unmitigated positive that there's no fighting that broke out.
Yeah, another one of the conflicts he has claimed to solve, where he also used trade um, prominently, was with Cambodia and Thailand. These countries, of course, have been, there's been flare ups of violence along their shared border for decades. And most recently in July, there were 38 people killed and thousands forced to flee their home. President Trump called both leaders and intervened and threatened to stop negotiations over trade. And this is hugely important both for Thailand and Cambodia because both are very reliant on exports to the US. And in August, they reached an agreement in Malaysia, agreed to a ceasefire. But, much like Serbia and Kosovo, Sumi, they didn't solve the underlying issue, which is this contested border, and they didn't address the 1,000-year-old Hindu temples along the 500-mile border. And since then, we have seen then trade accusations about violations of a ceasefire. In September, I think there were like 200 Cambodians who crossed into Thai territory to protest. And, the Thai military leaders later voted to indefinitely close the border with Cambodia. So I don't see that as a resolved conflict either, particularly when this border dispute is still unresolved.
And if we're talking about places where is there a conflict or not, we get to the 8th of these 8 wars, which is Ethiopia and Egypt. And I haven't really been able to find someone who says that they're at war, a war of words maybe, but there's no sort of hot armed conflict taking place there. They've long argued over access to the waterways around the Nile River, very, very contentious there, but it isn't an armed conflict at this point. It is something that Donald Trump got involved in his first term in office as well. At that time, President El-Sisi, who we saw him so closely with in Sharm el-Sheikh this week, had asked President Trump to get involved over a dispute about the building of a hydraulic dam. So some talks were initiated at that point. They didn't really go anywhere. President Trump issued a threat saying we'll blow up the dam if it's ever built. Well, construction has gone on and was completed this year. So as an expert in the area said to me, the dam is up now. What do you do?
So much of what Donald Trump, so much of his worldview and the way he views foreign policy is very much viewed through, these simplistic terms, I think. And that maybe is why he thinks he can claim these 8 wars. But it really, I think every conflict we walk through, there's just so much nuance. There's so much context. And there's, questions about follow through that just remain unresolved. So I think it's really hard, to give him credit for all of these when, there's a lot of questions that remain unanswered.
And of course, one of the big remaining questions is what will end up happening in the war that the president says he hasn't been able to solve until now, which is, of course, the war in Ukraine. He said it was the hardest and he hadn't expected it to be. And I'm also interested to see if the administration turns its attention to Sudan. We have been covering this as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, truly horrific, the suffering that we're seeing civilians be subjected to there. And every aid worker we speak to says we need to get people to lay down arms, and we have not been able to do so. And, at the UN, Katrina, as well, there's, a lot of discussion about the humanitarian aspect, but actually bring the warring parties, the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese forces, to a table to stop the fighting has not happened. And I haven't seen much at all of a focus in this administration on it.
Hopefully we'll have another follow-up episode of this podcast. That's 9, 10, 12, 15 wars that President Trump has solved, and some of the suffering in the world can be alleviated. And of course, in the short term, we will be keeping an eye on what happens in Gaza with the Board of Peace, of which President Trump is the chairman, designed to oversee the future of Gaza as well. But I think we've reached the end of our list of 8 wars for today. And who knows what we'll be talking about next week at the rate of things. We're still shut down. The government's still shut down here. Course.
Yes, I was going to say, the problem is you don't win a Nobel Peace Prize for brokering a deal on funding the government.
True. But, perhaps that will happen. Great to see you guys. And I guess till next week.
Exactly. Bye.
See you guys.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then do like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so please leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.